You may understand things others never will, and at some point in your life you stop trying to explain it. Not because you can't, but because you've learned that understanding doesn't automatically transfer just because you put it into words. You realize that perception is earned slowly, through attention, through restraint, through watching longer than most people are comfortable with. You begin to notice that understanding rarely comes from intelligence alone. It comes from the ability to sit still when others need to react, from the ability to observe without immediately inserting yourself into everything, from noticing patterns instead of chasing moments that feel important only because they're loud. You start seeing how often people confuse movement with progress, how being busy replaces being effective, how announcing effort becomes a substitute for actually sustaining it. You notice how many people talk about discipline, yet their lives are built entirely around how they feel that day. Motivated when it's convenient, exhausted when it's not, inspired for a moment, then gone. You notice the person who constantly talks about waking up early, but somehow always looks drained. The one who posts about mental health, but reacts emotionally to everything. The one who speaks about control, but explodes the moment something doesn't go their way. And what's interesting is that you don't feel the need to confront them. You don't feel superior. You simply see the contradiction and you let it exist. At the same time, you see the opposite type of person. The ones who don't explain themselves. They don't narrate their habits. They don't dramatize their routines. They don't build identities around beginnings. They show up, they repeat, they leave, and they do it again tomorrow. No announcements, no validation, no audience. You understand something most people miss. Real consistency leaves very little evidence. The disciplined ones rarely look impressive in the moment. They look average, predictable, sometimes even boring. And that's exactly why they last. Because discipline was never meant to entertain. It was meant to stabilize. People who lack structure tend to turn emotion into identity. Whatever they feel becomes who they are. Confident today, lost tomorrow. Calm in the morning, overwhelmed by night. You see how dangerous that is, because emotions are unstable foundations. They shift, they react, they demand attention. Discipline doesn't. Discipline is quiet. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care how you feel about it. It simply repeats itself until something changes. You notice how modern culture celebrates expression over control, speaking over listening, visibility over substance, reaction over reflection. And somewhere along the way, you stop wanting to be seen. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. You realize that most people don't actually want truth. They want confirmation. They want to feel justified, not challenged. They want to feel right, not accurate. You start noticing how many conversations aren't exchanges of ideas, but competitions of identity. Who's more informed? Who's more moral? Who's more evolved? You step back from that because you understand something subtle and uncomfortable. The need to constantly prove competence usually signals its absence. Epictetus once said,
If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid.
most people can't tolerate that idea. They need to be perceived as strong, aware, disciplined, confident. They build personalities around impressions. You see through this, and once you see it, it becomes impossible to ignore how fragile most of it is. You see how quickly confidence turns into aggression when challenged, how often dominance masks insecurity, how control is mimicked through volume. You also notice something else. True competence rarely needs speed. It doesn't rush to respond, it doesn't rush to react. It pauses. And that pause unsettles people. Silence makes insecure minds uncomfortable. They fill it with noise, with jokes, with opinions, with explanations no one asked for. You stay quiet, not because you lack thoughts, but because you understand that timing matters more than content. This awareness slowly separates you from crowds, not dramatically, not in a way that looks heroic, but quietly. You stop feeling excited by loud ambition. You stop being impressed by fast results. You stop trusting intensity without structure. You start trusting patterns instead. You notice who stays consistent when no one is watching, who remains composed when outcomes are uncertain, who doesn't collapse when praise disappears. And eventually, you realize something uncomfortable. Most people don't actually want discipline. They want the image of it. They want the aesthetic of control without the sacrifice, the respect without the restraint, the outcome without the repetition. You understand why that never works, because discipline isn't an accessory. It's a system, and systems don't care about moods. This is where the emotional weight comes in. You start feeling disconnected in conversations. You listen to people complain about problems they refuse to structure their lives around. You hear the same cycles repeated with different excuses. You could say something, but you know it wouldn't land. Understanding when not to speak is a form of intelligence most people never develop. Marcus Aurelius once said,
Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself.
"You live that, even when it costs you connection." Because being strict with yourself means you notice your own impulses, your own shortcuts, your own desire to be seen. You don't always win that battle, but you fight it quietly. You don't turn self-improvement into content. You don't weaponize your progress. You don't use discipline as a personality. And yes, sometimes you feel invisible. You watch people get attention for things you've been doing for years. You watch shortcuts get celebrated while foundations are ignored. You watch confidence rewarded even when it's hollow. That can turn into bitterness if you're not careful, so you learn another lesson. You learn that seeing more doesn't entitle you to more. It simply gives you responsibility. Responsibility to stay grounded, to stay human, to stay patient. Because understanding without humility becomes isolation, and isolation, unchecked, becomes resentment. You don't want that. You don't want to become someone who watches life instead of living it. So you move differently. You let others talk. You let them perform. You let them rush. You stay slow. You build competence instead of image. You build structure instead of narrative. You build calm instead of excitement. And over time, something shifts. You become harder to disturb, harder to provoke, harder to manipulate. Not because you're numb, but because you're anchored. You realize that the world rewards noise quickly, but stability eventually. Loud people burn fast. Quiet ones endure. So if you feel like you see through things too easily, if you notice the cracks beneath confidence, if you sense instability behind performance, it doesn't mean you're detached from reality. It means you're paying attention to it. You may understand things others never will. Not because you're superior, but because you were willing to sit with discomfort long enough to learn from it. And that understanding will never make you popular, but it will make you steady. And in a world addicted to reaction, steadiness is rare. Rare things are often lonely, but they last.